Most people that I come across think that Darwin originated the theory of evolution.
Well, that's not true, of course, John. He certainly popularized a form of it, but evolutionary thinking goes back to, well, in reality, almost the beginning of time.
That's right, and evolution has what we might call a dark history. And that's the title of this next program, The Dark History of Evolution. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Well, my topic for this session is the dark history of evolutionism. It's actually the second part of my two-part series on the long war against God. The first part is entitled The Troubled Waters of Evolution. The first part, which is on a separate video, is also in the first half of the book entitled The Long War Against God, and it deals with the terrible effects of evolutionism in the present world, impacting all of the philosophies of different religions and different economic systems and other systems, as well as serving as the so-called rationale for all the evil practices that take place in the world. So it's had a deadly effect, and I think it's not too much to say that evolutionism is the chief weapon, the basic weapon in Satan's war against God and his people. And of course, many people have the idea that this began with Charles Darwin some 125 years ago, but that isn't so. Actually, this goes far back beyond that, back to the very beginning of history, and that's what we want to talk about at this session, the long war against God in terms of the time before Darwin, on back through history. Now, let's begin with about the time of Charles Darwin. As most of you know, he's the one who's given credit for the theory of evolution, but he did not invent the theory of evolution. He did not even invent the theory of natural selection, for which he took credit and for which most people give him credit. Natural selection was the idea that evolution takes place through limitless variation and the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, which then gradually produce higher and higher orders of life in the plant and animal world. Well, natural selection was not invented by Darwin. In my studies for this book that I mentioned, actually I found at least 11 men before Darwin that had advocated the idea of natural selection. The main one, of course, was Alfred Russel Wallace, who was his contemporary, and finally there developed a sort of competition between them as to which would do it first, and they are to some extent given credit for discovering it together at the same time, but Darwin gets most of the credit, even though Wallace really anticipated him, and so did many others. It is significant, though, as we look into the events surrounding the life of Charles Darwin and those who were with him in London there in England in the mid-19th century, to find that this was also the time when there was a revival of ancient demonism, or they called it spiritualism, communicating with the spirits. Now this has come back into vogue today through the New Age movement and the so-called channeling process that many people profess to be able to use to get higher consciousness from the spirits that are around us. Well, the modern spiritualist movement, or spiritist movement would be a better term, began about the time of Darwin. And it's not too surprising, I would say, if it really is true that the concept of evolution, the natural chance order of developing higher systems without God, if this is really the weapon that Satan uses most effectively, it isn't surprising to see him active, particularly active at the time of Darwin. Now, the three men that probably have had more influence on human thought than any others in the period since Darwin, or along with Darwin, the other two would be Karl Marx, who was the founder of what has come to be communism, which almost ruled the world there for a while. It's now beginning to fail, but had a tremendous impact for a long time. And the other one is Sigmund Freud, the founder of the modern school of psychology. So Freud influenced the thought of people about human relationships, Marx about social and economic relationships, and Darwin about natural science. And between the three of them, they have profoundly changed the world. And it's interesting to note that all three of them seem to have had some occult influence behind what they contributed. Let me just document that very briefly. Take Karl Marx, for example. Many people assume that Marx was an atheist. Matter of fact, that probably isn't quite true. He started out as a professing Christian. As a matter of fact, as a young man in high school, he even wrote essays on Christianity. I've seen one of his essays on abiding in Christ. It sounds just like it was written by a very spiritual-minded young man. But shortly after he graduated from high school, he changed drastically. Richard Wurmbrand, who suffered severely under communism in Russia, was imprisoned for a long time, a pastor. Once he became free and got to this country, he began to devote the rest of his life to the study of communism and of Marxism. And in his book, Marx and Satan, Wurmbrand makes the case, I think conclusive case, that Marx was not an atheist, but was an occultist, and as a matter of fact was a Satanist. Here's what he says. Shortly after Marx received his certificate, that is, of graduation, something mysterious happened in his life. He became profoundly and passionately anti-religious. A new Marx began to emerge. He writes in a poem, "I wish to avenge myself against the one who rules above." And that became the great motivating purpose of his life, to avenge himself against God. In one of his poems, and he wrote a lot of poems in these early, younger years of his, he said this, "The hellish vapors rise and fill the brain till I go mad, and my heart is utterly changed. See this sword, the prince of darkness sold it to me. For me he beats the time and gives the signs. Ever more boldly I play the dance of death." Karl Marx, the founder of communism, which almost conquered the world. As far as Sigmund Freud is concerned, I guess the first modern psychologist and psychiatrist, and of course he developed the idea of counseling and so on in a completely naturalistic sense. And although many people now reject Freud's theories, they still acknowledge him as the father of modern psychology, and his influence in terms of atheism has been profound in all those who have followed him. A recent book by Dr. Paul Vitz, who's a first-rate scholar, I think, at New York University, reviewing the life and works of Sigmund Freud, studied the impact of religion on Freud. And here's what he says. A corollary emphasis treats of Freud's unconscious hostility towards the faith, that is, the Christian faith. Vitz details this was a consequence of a curious preoccupation with the devil, damnation, and the Antichrist. So instead of being just an out-and-out atheist, Freud was very much occupied with biblical teachings concerning Satan. In fact, Dr. Vitz then makes quite a case for the fact that Freud may have made a Faustian pact, as he calls it, with the devil. As far as Darwin is concerned, we don't have any evidence that Darwin himself became a spiritist or an occultist, but his contemporary and almost rival Alfred Russel Wallace did. Matter of fact, Alfred Russel Wallace was one of the leaders of the spiritualist movement in England at the time of its revival, at the time of Darwin. He wrote a profoundly influential book setting forth the evidences in favor of spiritism, which we would now call demonism, I think, showing that it was possible to communicate with spirits. And then he spent many years out in the jungles with the animistic tribes there. They also communicated with the spirits in their religious systems. And he was very much influenced by his contacts with them. He wrote extensive papers and studies on spiritualism, as well as many profoundly influential books on biology and even economics. He was a very brilliant man, although he had no education to speak of. Darwin was educated in theology at Oxford and Cambridge. Wallace had not even a high school education, but he educated himself and became an extremely capable naturalist and biologist. But being an atheist, as a matter of fact, he was a communist and even an anarchist for a long time. He was trying to find, like Darwin was, a natural explanation for evolution. And he began to think of the ideas of natural selection just like Charles Darwin was doing. Now, Darwin had started out as a professing Christian, one who believed the Bible and believed in creation. But sometime after he returned from an extensive voyage around South America on the ship called the Beagle, he suddenly changed his views, and he became strictly an evolutionist and an agnostic, and eventually essentially an atheist. There's some little indication that he might have converted back to a degree just before he died, but that's not certain. But for most of his life, at least, he was practically an atheist. And he was trying to develop his theory of natural selection as an explanation for evolution for a long time after that. For about 20 years, in fact, he was developing his book. He was gathering data and trying to make his theory foolproof. And his friends were urging him to publish this, but he kept putting it off until Wallace apparently arrived at the same theory. Now, Wallace, when he wrote that, his essay on natural selection was in the jungle. Let me read what Wallace says. Remember, this man was a leader in the Spiritist movement. He said, I was then, at February 1858, living at Ternate in the Moluccas, and was suffering from a rather severe attack of intermittent fever. which prostrated me every day during the cold and succeeding hot fits. During one of these fits, while again considering the problem of the origin of species, something led me to think of Malthus' essay on population. He's talking about an essay that was written by Thomas Malthus about how the human populations were multiplying faster than the food supply could take care of them, and so he argued, and Herbert Spencer argued, and others of that point of view at that time argued that they shouldn't do anything to help the poverty-stricken classes, let them die off because there was not enough food anyway, so it's better to let the ones who were more fit to survive live. And Darwin was influenced by that idea, and so was Wallace. He says, something led me to think of Malthus' essay on population. Then he says, it suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation the inferior would inevitably be killed off, and the superior would remain. That is, the fittest would survive. Then at once I seemed to see the whole effect of this. The whole method of species modification became clear to me. And in the 2 hours of my fit, I had thought out all the main points of the theory. That same evening, I sketched out the draft of a paper, and in the 2 succeeding evenings, I wrote it out and sent it by the next post to Mr. Charles Darwin. He knew Darwin was interested in the same subject, and he thought he would be thrilled to find that he, Wallace, had found the secret to evolution. And so he sent this paper to Darwin, and when Darwin saw it, he got very unhappy about it because he had been developing the same theory for 20 years and hadn't published his, and so he got busy and wrote out a brief summary of it, and that came out as the book that we know as The Origin of Species. He probably never would have published his book, which has so profoundly influenced the world in the succeeding century, had Wallace not sent him this draft of his essay and spurred him to do that. Now note this, Wallace, in 2 hours of a fit, when he wasn't even himself, and said it just flashed upon him, was able to do what Darwin had been taking 20 years to accomplish, not in the jungle like Wallace was, but in the midst of the most educated city in the world, and amidst all the scientists and people there at Oxford and Cambridge and the London area. And it does seem like something is happening here that is not meeting the eye right on the surface. Loren Eiseley of the University of Pennsylvania, one of the greatest historians of science, commenting on this, put it this way, he says, a man pursuing birds of paradise in a remote jungle did not yet know that he had forced the world's most reluctant author to disgorge his hoarded volume, or that the whole of Western thought was about to be swung into a new channel because a man in a fever had felt a moment of strange radiance. Well, you can't help but wonder if something really occult was happening here. After all, Satan is surely interested in trying to turn men away from God, and evolution has been his main weapon in doing that. And had it not been for his ability perhaps to communicate through the spirits with Wallace, it may never have happened. A paper written by a man by the name of William Coleman, who's a spiritist, called Evolution of the Spiritual Universe. This was published in 1900, so it's an old book, but it was published after Darwin. But he's reviewing the history of evolutionism and writings on evolution in the Spiritist movement. And he says this, not only is the material universe a product of the law of evolution, but the spiritual realm as well. Nature's Divine Revelations, he's citing a book now, Nature's Divine Revelations, by Andrew Jackson Davis, that's the author, was delivered in trance, in a demonic trance in 1845 and 47, which was about 15 years before Darwin's book was published. And in that book he says the evolution of the material world by natural laws was taught, including the development of higher species from lower and of man from the animal world, and then also extended that on into the spiritual realm, so that the whole of the universe is in a process of evolution, according to the spirits. And they were giving this to the spiritist mediums before Darwin. So it does seem like there may be something to the concept that evolution was the great weapon that was used at this time to change the whole tenor of thought in the so-called Christian world of the West. Well, but of course, not Wallace, not Darwin, not even Lamarck before them invented the theory of evolution. You can find many evolutionists before these people. They just were not as influential as Darwin turned out to be. Matter of fact, Darwin's grandfather, a man by the name of Erasmus Darwin, who was also an occultist and a pantheist and a medical doctor and a poet. He was a very influential man and wrote books on evolution before Charles Darwin was even born. And all the standard evidences for evolution that are still cited today in high schools and the public school system, such as comparative anatomy and the embryological recapitulation theory and geographical distribution and natural selection and so on, all of these were advocated as evidences in favor of evolution by Erasmus Darwin even before Charles Darwin was ever born. So you see, there's nothing new about evolution.